Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Thank you very much. Let's see if this works.
It works.
Hey. Well, we have lots to be excited about. Thank you very, very much for being here. And I appreciate the participation from the panelists from the various continents around the world. It's what makes this meeting so very important as we follow in the jet stream of the Brazilian community, and of course, the big jet stream, the rocket stream, I guess, is following the Knowledge Seekers workshops every week. And so we're getting new information. So thank you all for making the KAKT American Knowledge Team meeting so vital. And we try and add in our own way, because the everybody has their own that they can do this. And this is a KAKT Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. Here we are in the Intermediate Inertia series. We're hooked on life today, and my name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is March the 16th, 2025, and this is a part of the KAKT Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So let's carry on, and as we see, we're at the end of this series here, and what we've been trying to do through all the series is to condense the information in such a way that not only the experienced knowledge seekers, but the new knowledge seekers can be welcome and can understand in a different manner. Maybe that they can relate better because we're not all scientists, but we can't wait for everyone to come on stream, but we certainly can lay the path down. And sometimes that path is a little bit rocky. Sometimes that path is not well paved. And sometimes that path is really, really smooth. But our path right now is we're on the hesitancy highway, and we say that's the lowest energy state. So we mean the lowest energy state in terms of the physicality. But it doesn't mean the lowest energy state in terms of equality or in terms of status. There are some places that have different states, And some people are in a preferred position, and other people are absolutely untouchable. So we're at the frontier of the crossroads now, where, yeah, we love our chuck wagon tailgate parties, especially at the football games. And of course, we talk about the importance of accurate field goal kickers. Well, how accurate are we? And how much do we remember? Do we remember the San Francisco 49ers? Not the 1949ers, but the 1849ers. It's hard to remember the gold rush, isn't it? But there's always a gold rush. And remember that North America was founded by explorers, pioneers, and miners. Come to think of it, I think Africa was founded by explorers, pioneers, and miners. There always seems to be a catch. So we're always trying to search for outer space. And when we look at the cover of book number 3 and we see the origin of the universe and how colors came to be and all the colors came to be and created man's universe and the sister universe. And yet here we are in our little tiny perfect pie in the sky. And we're all searching for outer space. But we have to get hooked on life on the Plazo Highway to our pie in the sky, because that's a very smooth highway. It's also a very fast highway. So let's get into it. It would be very helpful if we all could read the books from Marin Tepekoli-Kesh, such as book number 1, The Universal Order of Creation of Matter, where we see the coming together of matter, dark matter, and antimatter. And that's book number 1. But book number 2 takes us from that position of matter to another position of matter via the structure of the light. And so that light, which you can't grab onto, but you can deflect it or you can absorb it, you just can't hang on to it like you would another structure, such as a handrail. And then, of course, is book number 3, which we said was the origin of the universe. And the origin of the universe was there, then where did the matter come from? And so this becomes kind of a dog chasing its tail kind of scenario, which kind of came first. So how about which one came first? Or how about which one came together? Which one was number 1? Isn't number 1 first? Or is number 1 our present position? And so we've been trying to figure this thing out for 369 weeks in a row. 369. Isn't that interesting? And the members of the Universal Council, led by Rick Crammond, have been trying to bring justice and world peace to this planet. And when we talk about the members of the Universal Council, these members are of the planetary Universal Council. Well, let's all remember that there is a Universal Council. There has to be, because remember in book number 2, the structure of light, where did that come from? And did that structure of light bring these 10 commandments that we grew up with? And now we find out it's another 14. And why do we need these commandments? It's when you were born, did you bring the commandments with you? Or was that given to you after you were born? So if it was given to you after you were born, then what was given to you before you were born? And if you say, well, there was nothing given to you before you were born, well, how is that possible? Because you were born. So if you came from nothing, maybe that's why people think that you're good for nothing. But it doesn't matter what they think. It's what you think that matters. And so, do you need these commandments to tell you how to live? Or does your soul automatically know? Well, we all need a refresher, right? So, thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not lie, and cheat, and steal, and rape, and all the other good things that make this world go round. And are they good things? Or are they bad things? Because if the Creator created everything, would the Creator admit to having created bad things? Or are we interpreting them improperly, misusing them, and abusing them? So how do we get on this plasma highway? So what we've been trying to do is determine our position on the transmission highway. And for this, we have the attributes of frequency, pressure, and heat. And of course, it's at the lowest energy level. But we know that we can go higher. We can have higher frequency, higher pressure, higher heat. Okay, but that's still on the lowest energy level. So that means in order to step up, we have to change the playing field. And that would become the transition highway. But it's at that point now we have alternatives. We can either go higher or we can come back down. And so that becomes a question. But in the long-term goal is to get on the transmutation highway. And the reason we want to do that is because that highway is not congested. The traffic on that highway moves so fast, and there are no accidents, and there's no far away. In fact, there is no away. This is the problem with garbage. You can't throw it away because the way doesn't exist, but there is a path. So how do we get on that highway, and how do we follow that path, and what does it mean? So there is a carbon inertia highway that is kind of sight unseen. And it has to do with either increasing or decreasing the mass of carbon. And so on the upper energy states, we see that in the transition highway, we see carbon 14 and carbon 10, and we see a relationship of 1.4 to 1. But when we total it up, it's 24. And when we go to the plasma highway, we have carbon 16 and carbon 8, and the ratio is 2 to 1. But when we total it up, it's still 24. So that causes us a problem with the carbon 12, because we only look at the carbon 12 in its singularity. But if we want to see it in its actuality, we have to take something else into account. And if we do that, where we have another carbon 12 to refer to, and there we can see the one-to-one relationship, and well, that makes perfect sense, right? Because not only are we first, but we're also number one. And we can clearly see that with respect to the ratios, that's the lowest ratio. So that is the lowest energy field. But does it make sense that we are in the singularity, except if we're in the duality, then the rest of it is in duality as well. So now we have more choices. Not only can we elevate to a higher energy state, but we have other energy states to elevate to. And which one is it? And what determines which one it is? And who's doing the determination? And so what's beyond that? And then we find out that everything that we see is what we see as opposed to what we don't see. Why don't we see what we don't see? Is it because we can't see it? Or is it because we don't want to see it? When we are in the lowest energy state, we only see the physical matter state. But as we transition to higher energy states, we have added skills. And so that which we can't see may become visible if we have the eyes to see. So the vast majority of us are only seeing half the picture because we're only seeing what is allowed to be seen. And so who is doing the allowing? Are we restricting ourselves? So many questions. But what we know with the plasma inertia is that it comes together through a junction point. So we could have one track coming together with another track. And so we could take the lowest transition matter with the highest transition matter. And how do we get there? Well, we have to have a transfer dimension in between. So the lower transition and the transfer state combines as a plasma inertia to create a higher transition. So that's our high junction, but then we have a medium junction. So the same principle applies, except now we're taking the same things into account, but in a different perspective, where we take the high transition matter and the low transition matter, and there we have the plasma inertia field of a transfer state. So now from that transfer state, obviously being in between, medium, we can go higher or lower. Okay. Well, let's say if we go lower, well, look at that. Now we have a different kind of plasma inertia junction where the higher transition matter and the transfer state combine as a plasma inertia to create the lower transition matter state. So as a rule, we need to understand that when we're looking at a picture, we're only seeing half the picture. There is another picture there. So we have to understand and take into account that what we are seeing is a manifestation of a plasma inertia junction. And so that junction point is at the middle. And if that junction point is at the middle, then we have to decide which side of that junction are we on. And if we have to pick a side, will we all pick the same side? Well, the answer is, of course, since you were born on this planet, we've all picked the same side. So now we're saying that there's another side. We have to understand that because there's a conservation of inertia. You see, the MAGRAV energy transfer state has to take into account, and as we found with our plasma science, that we can go from the atomic state to the nanostate to the GAN state, but there's always the two sides. And the thing is that we're mixing things up. So we have things that are in the atomic state, and we have things in the nanostate, and we produce something in the GAN state. So not only can we go from side to side, but we can go up or down. And if we can go from side to side, that means we can go from left to right or right to left. But if we can go up or down, that means we can go from down up or from up down. And oh, so we have many variables to choose from. And then which variables do we choose? And that becomes the question of susceptibility. So there is a consistency. So some people think that chaos is the consistency. And so they create consistent chaos. And we're not just talking about warmongers. It could be just within your own family. Some people just revel in that chaotic environment. But the chaos theory says that it's just random. How can it be consistent if it's random? So we look at the scientific community and they're very centered on being consistent. And of course, the religious community, they talk about a certain kind of consistency, but they generally only talk about that one day a week. The other 6 days, well, we'll just have to wait to be consistent. So what we are consistently looking for is the practical application of it. So we have to determine what factor is at play to make this practical application consistent for us. So there is a plasma rule where the higher strength feeds the weaker strength. But there's an earthbound rule where the higher strength beats the weaker strength, or the higher strength eats the weaker strength. Well, or the higher strength kills the weaker strength. So these all become conflict points. But these conflict points become binding zones, because in order to have that conflict, both adversaries have to be in the same zone. And so in that binding zone of adversaries, there is this conflict. And then, of course, the higher strength will be the winner. But can you win without losing? And so as you enter this binding zone, you have to ask yourself, are you going to be the winner or are you going to be the casualty? Well, don't think about that, because just think about your self-serving needs, binding your own energy, and understand that in this conflict point, we're binding our energy at the expense of others. So if we're in the lowest energy state and we're stealing energy from others, then we are literally going to the poverty bank. But if we enlist the services of the higher energy, then we're going to the abundant bank, the cornucopia of abundance. And so it changes the relationship. So there's a tensity in that relationship. In the plasma science, we discuss it as magnetical and gravitational balance, and that would be a MAGRAV condition. But that doesn't mean that the magnetical and gravitational are equal, because if they were equal, there would be no flow. And so the scientific community has an understanding that there's a relationship between the conservation of magnetic fields versus the conservation of energy. And that is discussed in our awake state. And the spiritual community is looking at the conservation of the spirit versus the conservation of the soul. and has a mild reference to the dream state. So there's a relationship between the awake state and the dream state, and the plasma science is what adds to the knowledge. And so these relationships are developed, but they can develop slowly or they can develop quickly. So that becomes the overriding question. At what rate of change can we succeed in bringing the scientific and spiritual communities together to, shall we say, not cooperate so much, but to reflect the rules of the plasma universe? So the plasma universe has natural creation, and it also has natural decay. But that's part of the creation. And we see ourselves as four-wheelers of that creation. But we only have two wheels on the creation side and two wheels on the decay side. And that's kind of a good thing because that keeps us in balance. But what bonds these things together? And so that's the topic we've been discussing for the last little while, the inertia bonding factor. That's the factor. Well, where is this factor? And because we can't see it, maybe we can't measure it, or maybe we're just making it up. Maybe we're just fudging the whole thing. But in reality, we have a relationship between the creation and the decay. So because we can't understand it, or we can't explain it, or don't want to explain it, then we fudge it. But the fact of the matter is there is an inertia bonding factor, and that's what brings us all together. So you don't have to understand it. You just have to understand that there is a practical application to this. It's called life, and it gives us the magnetical dependency is based on the attraction and repulsion of plasma forces. We call it gravitational intensity balanced off by the magnetical outintensity. And that's the balance between what we call feedback and feeding. In science, we also call it either an electron or a neutron, those being the two extremes of the atomic structure. Well, we are all on this planet, which is made from this atomic structure, and we are made from this atomic structure, and we're all part of the humanity civilization. And look at us, look at us. We have a contention dependency. And what does that mean? Well, we may be on one planet, but each of us is of one race. And who's number one? And so in order to understand who number one is, we have to understand who the other one is. And once we identify who the other one is, then we have a contention. So without the other one, we don't have a contention. So we are dependent on the other one for that contention. That's why we have a contention dependency. So if our reference is only the humanity civilization, then the contention becomes humanity versus humanity. Well, how do you differentiate from the man who caresses his child to the man who pulls the trigger on the gun to kill someone else's child? Because let's face it, a child is a child and is part of the humanity civilization. So why is there a contention based on whose child it is when all the children are the children of the humanity civilization? So we become dependent on this contention, And it's, fulfilling our understanding of our existence. Well, we were forced to develop the cups of life. And that was another fulfillment of our existence because we found the emotional inner strength that we had in our inner space. And we discovered the nano-monatomic science. And also we discovered the GANS process. And then we discovered the importance of carbon and how it fits. So getting back to the plasma highway, we see that the cup of life was not only able to produce the carbon dioxide GANs, but through its GANs radiance manifestation, we were able to produce calcium, copper, zinc, water, and amino acid. And we can even produce gold. But fundamentally, what was important to us is to reinforce our emotional and our physical structure. So we had those two cups. When we put them together and added the cup of soul, now we had a combination of three cups. And still, we had the magnetical gravitational relationship. So each cup had that relationship plus a soul. But collectively, all three cups together had a collective soul. And they acted as one. One cup, one soul. And then, of course, was the cup of the universe, which was another cup. And it was the bringing together, not of the two cups, but of the two hemispheres of the brain. And they were mimicking the same type of GANS production in carbon, copper, and zinc. So the carbon, the connection to the universe, the zinc, the connection to the emotional structure, and the copper, the connection to the physical structure. And the three of them come together. And we have one other thing we have to take into account, because in order to come together somewhere, we have to be somewhere. And that somewhere is the grand central station of the earth. And as such, we have the earth and all of its ganses. And so this becomes very important for us because we are part and parcel of all of these ganses as well. That's the reason we came to earth, because that was our little sentimental pie in the sky. So that was us somewhere. It happened to be earth. But where is that? So we maintain a positional consistency, not so much by where we are, but where we are not. So we were not Venus, we were not Mars. And even when we orbit the sun, we are still tracking the same path. And it isn't like we're always tracking at the same speed. In terms of rotation, but we are tracking at the same speed in terms of the diameter of the orbit. And so if that is the case, then we're never shoulder to shoulder, except at some instance during our orbit. And that is a flash in the pan because we're all moving. So yeah, we're moving at the same speed, but we are moving in a different orbit. So there's an overlapping field that determines the track that we follow. Okay, then. So all of the atoms that we see on the grand central station of the Earth space have this makeup where we have a neutron. And in the plasma science, we see that the neutron is the precursor for the atom, which the atom is basically an electron-proton combination. But then the electron is negative and the proton is positive, and the total of that does not equal the mass of the neutron. So what was missing was the release of the PM tick. So now when we look at the atomic dependency, we see that in the fundamental breakup of the neutron, we are creating the atom. And so the atom is dependent on the breakup of the neutron. But in turn, by releasing the PM tick, then we find that the PM tick itself is dependent on the creation of the atom. So there's an interdependency on all three, but there's an implication that the PM tick is the discard as far as the atom is concerned. But as far as the neutron is concerned, maybe the atom is the discard. But if we created a PM tick and an atom, then maybe the neutron is the discard. And so if we move from one, say, mag-rav condition, be it a neutron, move it to another mag-rav condition, say the atom, is the demise of one the creation of the other? Well, where is this? Because without being somewhere, you really can't exist in that regard, in the existence that we understand, atomically, physically. So we look at the periodic table of consistency, where we have consistently elements in certain spaces on the Earth space. And so the entire table are the details of the Earth space range. So we have copper, we have zinc, we have iron, we have gold. But more importantly, we have carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, because those are the building blocks of life. And yes, they're important, because from there, we can create all the other elements. And then we look at sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, and these all are facilitating change in energy state. There's a process that's going on there. And so with that process, it becomes a plasma inertia junction. And so on that basis, we can be low, medium, or high in terms of energy. So the way the periodic table of consistency is organized, each of these elements is based on, in terms of number, atomic numbers, based on the number of protons. But they also have neutrons, except for hydrogen. It doesn't have any neutrons. Unless hydrogen goes into a different energy state, and then it does have a neutron. So which is it? Is it hydrogen 0, or is it hydrogen 1? Or is it hydrogen 2? Or 3? Because we say that helium is 4. 2 protons and 2 hydrogens. So just in simple math, we're having a little inconsistency in our periodic table of consistency. So in the beginning, there was a neutron that came before the atom and the PM tick, as we said. So We said, let there be light. Well, where does that light come from? It comes from the darkness. So we really don't know where it comes from because we can only see what comes to us. What's going away from us, we can't see. And if it's going somewhere, but we can't take that into account. So we are just saying that let there be light. So the neutron came before the atom and the PM tick. But, like where did the neutron come from? Because in the beginning, oh yes, of course, there was the principal matter, the PM tick. And so that, of course, was magnetical because it comes together and brings together the antimatter, the dark matter, and the plasma matter, and converts it into a plasmagen, which is like a MAGRAV inertia field. And then that inertia field is a force field, and it gets diluted in its interaction with the Earth space. And so the Earth space field and the plasmagen field create an inertia field, which is a field interaction. And so that becomes the manifestation of everything that we see here in the matter state. But the matter state has a unique characteristic that we can see it and we can touch it, but it also has a plasmatic state which we can't touch or can't see, but it is adjoining to our physical state. So when we say, well, we can't feel it, well, yes, we can, because we have feelings. So we can feel it, but we also have hands, and with those hands, we can feel it. So feeling is kind of a nebulous term, but it applies to how we are feeding ourselves, and then, of course, feeding back. And the point of this is that we are feedback dominant. And this is becoming a real block to our understanding of what is the difference between me and my shadow. So we have a core dependency, which is the neutron. But we have a corollary where it could be the proton. So the neutron being neutral, but the proton being positive. There was a change there, but both of them are gravitational. And then we look at the electron, and it could be a positron. There's a change there, but it's magnetical. So we can't just arbitrarily say, well, that's me and that's my shadow, because me created that shadow. So you can step on me, but you can't step on my shadow. But I can move my shadow by moving me. So which is it? Does it have to be segregated, or does it explain how things are working? So when we look at this gravitational confirmation, which we need to ascertain, let there be light. Well, we can see that with the hydrogen emission spectrum, it actually creates a fingerprint of light. We call it a fingerprint because it's unique. But with this fingerprint, it is clearly a signature for the hydrogen. So that fingerprint becomes a unique print. But that hydrogen has the same fingerprint wherever it is. But on Earth, we have another element, the oxygen, and it has a fingerprint. It is different. So it too is a gravitational conformation. And it too has a unique fingerprint which can be replicated in any other place. But uniquely, the two of them come together on Earth and create this blue planet. So the coming together on this sphere is a coming together of 3 dimensions. And so we have 3 belief feeding dimensions and 4 experience feedback dimensions. Because we have 1 plus 1, not the same one, plus another one, again, not the same one, but it's more than 3 because we haven't determined what the limitation is, because there's something that's missing, and that's our observation. And our observation is part of the feedback. And we can be as objective or subjective as we wish. So in other words, that we can fudge that detail. And is that detail representative of our belief, or is it representative of our experience? So we are in the 4th dimension looking at this. And so that means we become part and parcel of the whole thing. In other words, we cannot extricate ourselves from these dimensions. We cannot pop out of these dimensions like you pop a cork out of a wine bottle. So there's an inertia feeding. And we have to understand that at 1 plus 1 equals 1, but which one? So each one has 2 fields that are contributing. So that takes care of 1 and gives you a field strength feeding dimension. But then there's another one, and it would be different in some way. And then that one becomes another feeding dimension. And then there's another one, an inertia of another one. And it too is different in some way. And then we bring that together. And so this other feeding dimension is not the same as the other feeding dimensions. So this is what we have to understand, that when we're saying 1, we're saying the product of 2. But not only, because for this example, we're only asking for 2. But what we're seeing is that if we bring 3 feeding dimensions together, then that becomes more than 3, because we're the observer and we're applying our feedback to it. But we can change the feeding, right? So maybe 1 was 1 at that time, but now it's a different one. So maybe we're just switching 2 feeding dimensions around. But what happens if we scramble everything? Let's just totally have an inertia feeding scramble. So we now have another field strength inertia, but not the same one and not in the same position. We still have one and another one and another one, but not the same one and not in the same position and not in the same sequence either. But They would be part of the nuclear feeding inertia. Because the periodic table of consistency of the Earth space details have different atoms, and they're all atomic, but they're all different in terms of mass. So, atomically speaking, each element is one. But from a nuclear standpoint, they're not the same one. But if we bring a copper atom together with another copper atom, then those would be twins, right? Not exactly. Not exactly. Because each of these nuclear feeding inertia are just fragments of the complexity of the whole universe. So therefore, each atom is a combination of different elements. Each atom is a combination of different field strengths. Each atom is a combination of different PM ticks. And these PM ticks come together from different directions and from different places. And they come via a different path. So, many times I made reference to Herman Weyl, where he says a definite portion of matter occupies a definite part of space at a definite moment of time. But there's no such thing as one and the same energy, which constitutes a charge at two adjacent increments of time. This embodies the principles of flow and connection. So if there's a flow, which means that each PM tick is unique, but there's a connection. And so the connection becomes the common denominator of the atomic bond. But they're not twins. Because they have a common bond, but they come from different parts of space at a different moment in time. And it doesn't have to be a vast difference. Adjoining parts of space and adjoining moments of time are still different. So there's no such thing as one and the same energy, although all of them originate as energy packs. So what that means is that there's an interdependence between the magnetical and gravitational field strength. And if it was just on the physical side, then the left side balances the right side. But if we were just to look at the difference between the physical state and the plasma state, then the lowest energy state, the physical, would be on one side, and the higher plasma state would be on the other side. And so if those two things are true, then on the plasma state, one side would balance off the other side. So there's always this interdependency. And so we can work left to right or top to bottom. Let's remember what we talked about ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. This becomes the currency of life. We think that money is the currency of life. That's the currency of our society. But in biology, ATP is the currency. And there are 36 ATP are produced from one glucose molecule. And one glucose molecule is what we are eating. But there are three dimensions. And if we can choose one, we have to understand it's a combination of three probabilities. And if we say that one is not the same one as the other one, and we know that it's not the same because each one has overlapping field strengths, but let's say that the matter state is 1 and the dark matter is 2 and the antimatter is 3, although they're all one matter state. But if we bring together 1 plus 1 plus 1, so that would be one matter state plus one matter state plus another matter state. But since they all come and they're all unique, they're coming at a different point in space at a different time, there's still one. And so they all come together as one combination of three. But it is possible, as we've said, to cross over, not only from the left side to the right side, but from the lower energy state to the higher energy state. So we could have a 1 plus 1 plus 2, or a 1 plus 1 plus 3. And if you follow the patterns, we see that in order to choose 3, we have 9 possibilities where we have 1 in the first choice. If we introduce 2 in the first choice, we have another 9 possibilities. It's still the same numbers, but now they're in a different position. So when we talk about phosphorylation, and 36 ATP are derived from one glucose, and the glucose is in a hexagonal cubic format, the terminal points, the edges, and the points are phosphorylated, and that glucose becomes fructose. That happens within the plasma state. And so how it happens is that the polarity of the endpoints are all flipped. And if we can flip all of them, then we can create the fructose. And so we have to understand that one of the problems in our health system is that we cannot gain this benefit by eating fructose. We have to produce the fructose. And that's a huge difference. And this fructose becomes very important because it is in the plasma state. So that plasma state is a manifestation of an inertia field. And so even when we look at the inertia of the mind, we see that the inertia of the mind is a product of the soul of the earth as an inertia field, and the soul of the man as an inertia field. And that coming together with the soul of the physicality, which is another inertia manifestation, allows for the creation of the physicality of man. Except that the physicality of man is determined by the precursor, the physicality of the earth. So the energy state has to come from the top down and cross over to facilitate that action. So there's an initiation in terms of the inertia, and there's a completion of the inertia, and then there's a repeat cycle. But in order for that repeat cycle to be there, there has to be a communication. So let's remember that our physicality is the product of the inertia of the mind. So if we add a third combination, we now introduce another 9. So now we have 27 probabilities. And in order for this to work, there has to be an attraction. And so in the science of attraction, opposite poles attract. So if the one is negative and the other is positive, then the next one would be attracted, the negative to the positive, and then the next one would also be attracted to the negative to the positive. So now you have a link up. And these link ups can all have, in this case, about 27 possibilities, for instance. So we see that the amino acids are also a link up. And the thing about these amino acids is that the essential acids are slightly alkaline. But okay, so that's an anomaly. But anyway, the point of the matter is that we call it omega 3, 6, and 9. There's that 3, 6, 9 again. And these are the bend points. And if you look at this from a different perspective, it kind of looks like a fish hook, doesn't it? Well, that's today's subject. We're hooked on life. And in that process, we create oxygen because we have a bringing together, a compression of energy coming together from the hydrogen, which has been released from its position. But on the outside, we lose 1 hydrogen. On the inside, we lose 2 hydrogen. And so that 2 hydrogen will combine with the oxygen and produce water. But when we produce alpha-linolenic acid, we're producing 3 times as much, a higher strength combination. And so we see that when we produce the protein, we also produce the water. And protein and water do not mix. And if they did, well, we'd all be bags of mush, and we're not. But obviously, hydrogen is playing a huge game in this, and there's a hydrogen dependency. And so we see that the hydrogen molecule comes in pairs also. And so what we call the orthohydrogen is where the polarity is in the same direction. Well, wait a second. Then we just say that the opposite poles repel. Well, yeah. So at the top, the North Pole, they repel because they're both negative. But at the South Pole, they're both positive, so they still repel. Same rules apply, whether it's positive or negative. But interestingly enough, with the parahydrogen, one of the hydrogen molecules kind of flips, reverses its polarity. And it can do this along the covalent bond. So that kind of becomes a swivel, if you will. So now we have a positive and negative on the North Pole, and of course they would attract. But wait a second, there's an opposite pressure where the South Pole is also opposite, and so it balances out. So all what you're doing is you're getting a flipping of the essential fatty acid, and you're linking up all of this hydrogen and increasing the density of it. And so we're creating matter. That's a plasmatic matter. And so from that plasmatic matter, we're bringing in not only hydrogen and oxygen, but in our environment, we have abundant nitrogen. And so there's a containment dependency on this, and the missing link is the carbon. And isn't it interesting that the hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen are gaseous, and the carbon, the way we understand it, is a solid. But we know that the carbon can be a gas as a carbon dioxide. And so we can understand that we need this as a containment dependency for our amino acid, and that there is a common denominator insofar as that they all can be gases, but in a different kind of containment, a different kind of interaction. And so when we talk about the arrival of the PM tick and it being unique, the reason the arrival is unique is because there's a lag time. Since no two energy packs can occupy the same position at the same time, then they may be common. They may have the same field strength. They may have the same mass or the same energy, but they are coming from a different position. And that position matters. So when we're looking at the hydrogen and how it operates as a covalent bond, we see there's a flipping of poles. When we're looking at the combination of three, and they are attracted to each other, that is positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative. If they suddenly flipped their poles and became repelling each other, like poles. So in this picture, we only have to flip one, the middle one, because between 2 and 3, it would be positive to positive, opposite, like poles repel. Between 1 and 2, negative to negative, like poles repel. And so this becomes an interesting point because it affects the sequencing in the Krebs cycle. So we say that there are 3 levels of energy, the cytochrome A, B, and C. And on each of those energy levels, we're producing 12 ATP. So it's the amalgamation of all 3 energy levels that create 36 ATP, which is part of the healthy cell conditioning. And we get 36 ATP from one glucose molecule. And then each cell in the body has calcium. And I just want to point out that the atomic number of calcium is 20, but the mass is 40. So, in other words, we would have 20 protons and 20 neutrons. So the creation of 36 ATP is pretty important in terms of a common denominator having the nearness and proximity to calcium somehow, but not exclusively to calcium, because we have all the other products as well, because there's a cellular consistency where the cells regenerate consistently and the organelles inside the cells regenerate consistently. And the amalgamation of cells creating organs, they regenerate consistently. So the regeneration is targeted consistently. And the nose knows this. So there's a plasma chain. But that plasma chain is creating a magnetical and a gravitational field force where the external forces have a lower density and the internal field forces have a higher density. So there where we have a higher density, we have an internal pressure. And then that becomes gravitational. And so we know that the neutron is part of the gravitational process. But there's an interaction with the out density. And so the higher strength feeds the lower strength. So the gravitational neutron does the feeding. Then the question becomes, how do the cells get fed? So we see that there's a two-way street. The only way we can do that two-way street is by doing the polar flipping. So we find that there's a consistency. And so when we look at the physical state, and when we look at a polymer, they consistently reproduce. And they create a long chain. But there's a chain replication in the plasma state. But the chains, when they become short, and to form a protein, they have to fold over. And so that's the difference between a protein and a polymer. The proteins consistently reproduce. We know that because that's part of the cellular repair. So there are fields inside and there are fields outside. There's an interaction of those fields, and the results vary, although the rules are the same. So this is the roadmap to the plasma highway. What we have to understand is that the higher strength feeds the lower strength. So our connection to the universe through the carbon-14 is connected to our soul of physicality and gives us 80% of our strength. But it's also connected to our physicality in the carbon-12. And there's a feedback from the carbon-12 back to the soul of physicality. And we supplement the remaining 20% of what we need. And hopefully, when we go to sleep at night, we reconnect with our soul to begin the process for the next day. But this doesn't just happen once a day. This is happening 250,000 times per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we're busy, very, very busy. We need a lot of energy, and that's the roadmap. But there's a problem. When we alter the Krebs cycle and we find that in the cytochrome B, we're only producing 2 ATP because it's in an anaerobic state. All the other healthy cells are operating in an aerobic state, which is loaded with oxygen. But in an unhealthy cell, we're producing ATP in an anaerobic state. So A and C are producing it aerobically, but B is anaerobic and it needs to supplement. And so this is the fundamental problem why our plasma highway is unhooked, because we are disconnected on that final feedback. The only time that we seem to connect is when we go to sleep. But we ignore that fact. It's just a dream. So we literally get hooked up in our own entanglement because we get 80% from the universe, and thank God for that, because in our own ignorance, we would really go hungry. But we feed back 20% through our feeding habits. And unfortunately, the chickens, the cows, and the fish, and even the vertical people are doing the same thing. So in order for us to do that supplementation, we have to steal from them. So what happens to them? You know, they are shortchanged, aren't they? And in turn, they sacrifice their life for our well-being. But since there's a connection that way, we cannot extricate ourselves from that particular process. And so that really, really hooks us into that entanglement. And we become like a dog chasing its tail. And every cycle reduces the energy. And every cycle reduces the energy because, as we know with the orbiting satellites, every time they go around the planet, they get a little bit closer. And we know that that is the same thing that happens with light. So when we look at the color spectrum, we see that the light changes color, and it changes color by frequency. And yet, every color is traveling at the speed of sound, or the speed of light, consistent speed. And so, well, that's interesting too. I made a faux pas. The speed of sound, it also travels at the speed of sound. But it seems to travel differently through different densities. Also, that's the same characteristic of light. But the color is affected by the density. And the density is affected by the nearness to the gravitational field. So we seem to think that based on the maggrav size, that the field strength of the red would be bigger. So therefore, it would be positive. It would be gravitational. And based on surface to volume ratio, the ultraviolet would be highest surface to volume ratio and therefore negative and therefore magnetic. But of course, if we're looking at density, then it's opposite. Then the red becomes part of the magnetical outintensity and the ultraviolet becomes part of the gravitational intensity. So it really depends on our point of view, doesn't it? And then if we elevate to a next level and we see that the plasma density operates the same way, it's the same rules. And so is the outer space density. So the thing is that even though we can't measure it and we can't put our finger on it, we have to understand that it's also following the same rules. And all we have to do is look around us to see the various examples and understand that, you know, whatever we're doing as pioneers in America here, depending on your point of view, could be a reflection of what we're doing or is just an illusion. So we need to have an understanding of how do we achieve this magnetical consistency. So we find in the neutron, we have overlapping fields, but in the electron, we have electrons on the same path. So looking at matter state, we see that it's an inertia field. That is a coming together where 1 + 1 + 1 is more than 3. And if we understand the inertia fields at this point in time, then we understand that they are coming together from various field strengths. And we know that because they have different densities, and we know that because we see different colors. But since they're coming, as we said in book number 2, they're coming from one mag-grav condition to another mag-grav condition. And so therefore, there are 2 matter inertia states. In other words, one matter state has a twin matter state, and the other matter state has a twin, and the other one has a twin. So the coming together of these matter states is an inertia field of the universal creation of matter, and the source of coming together are the common denominator that bring it all together. So to redraw the other diagram, the inertia field of the soul not only feeds the soul of physicality, but feeds the physicality. And then the physicality feeds back to the soul of physicality. But in our disconnected state, our feedback bypasses the soul. Because you know what? We know better, don't we? And so that becomes a disconnect, a short circuit. That becomes a feedback short circuit. And it is that feedback that becomes the matter state hook. So fortunately for us, the soul is always feeding. It doesn't matter what we're doing, except we become the benefactors of if we're doing it well or poorly. So since we are in the matter state inertia field, we always want to be fed with the cups of life. And we always say, well, feed me, feed me, feed me, and feed me. So here we are, hooked on life, aren't we? Are we satisfied or are we hungry? So is that what the universe intended for us to do, is to be hungry? Look at the Earth space. What's feeding the Earth space? It has a matter state inertia as well. And so it's getting fed. But it's getting fed by the same rules that we are. In other words, the creation of the universe exists from energy, and energy is a charge in motion. So the motion direction is the charge. And if there's a direction, then it has to come from somewhere or go somewhere. And if that is the case, then all things are working in combination. And now we understand the universal order of creation, where the matter state, the dark matter, and the antimatter are coming together to create the matter. But we didn't say which energy state this matter is, and we didn't say which energy state is the combination state. We just said that the Earth space matter state is all part of the fragments of the complexity of the universe. We're just in our little tiny perfect world, and we're just a fragment of the whole. Well, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that because the earth is our little heaven. And that's why we all came here. This is the humanity matter state inertia. We came here because of the same rules, but we had to come here after the earth came here. The earth had to be here before we could come here. So it's all following the same surface to volume ratio rules, which indicate the charge. And so it also is an inertia to field strength ratio. There are different field strengths in different positions. And these positions affect the inertia. And in order to balance out this equation, which seems to be kind of nebulous because 1 plus 1 plus another 1 isn't equal to 3, but it's more than 3 because you still have the 1 and you have the 3 and you're the observer observing everything together. And it's variable. So we can't be very specific in that regard. And that's why there are 8 billion unique people on this planet, along with countless millions of horizontal people and vertical people known as plants and animals. So the observer to field strength ratios are actually 1 plus 1 plus 1 is actually more than even 4. So now we put in a multiplier and we don't know how much more because the matter state plasma is a matter state inertia. So when we look at the inertia fields of the periodic table of elements, we find that the mass increases and the density increases. So the matter state physicality is changeable, and the matter state gravitational physicality is stable in the solid state or in the atomic state. But the atomic state is part of the matter state physicality, but only one aspect of it. We have other ones. So what we're looking at, the observer to field strength ratio, is part of the gravitational neutron, the observer inertia. We are the observers. And so we see what we see based on our capability. But if we could enhance our capability, then we could see more. So our observer field strength is susceptible because we have belief feeding dimensions complete with our experience feedback dimensions. So each of us has different experience. Each of us has come through life through a different path, through a different part on this planet, through a different family. We come through different societies. And yet we're all part of this Earth space. So we're all gravitational neutrons. And so how we view life is based on the balance between our belief and our experience. So do we believe our experience or do we experience our belief? Well, that all depends on if you're believing in the feeding or you're dependent on the feedback. And as we said, that's one of the limitations of humanity. We are feedback dominant, matter state dominant. And so this is why we have a problem to determine how big is large. Oh, it's really big. So we have weak nuclear forces that are far away, but they have to be strong because they're holding the planets together, so they must be really big. But the strong nuclear forces are near, and they must be near because they're nuclear. So because they're small, they're actually quite weak. So we're kind of confused, and it's affecting our core consistency because we're only taking the matter state into account. And now we find out that there's other things that we have to take into account. So the inertia fields become a combination of feeding fields. And those feeding fields become individual inertia fields from other feeding fields. So we just need to adapt in our point of view to understand that what we have in terms of our creation is a result. And so when we say that we're going to do something, there's a lot of responsibility that is attached to that. Because one is a response to our soul, and two, it's a response to our interaction to another soul. And if we understand that each of those is an inertia field coming together, then we understand that there are variables, and can we accommodate that? And if we can work towards with that, then we can have peace and prosperity. And if we don't, then we have conflict. And what is the result? The result is that we have a gravitational confirmation that we all wanted to be here. And yet we have conflict. Well, if we all wanted to be here and we were all here, then why is there conflict? So it kind of boils down to energy, doesn't it? And so what we've seen is that there's an energy sequencing because there's a gradient charge from the magnetical to the gravitational. And so in our understanding, the lowest energy being the magnetic energy, then the progressively higher through the electric, electromagnetic, then the nuclear coming from the atomic. But beyond the nuclear is the plasma science. And now we're discussing the soul of the body and the soul of the man. And each of these is at a higher energy state. And it's a logarithmic state. In other words, by orders of magnitude, at least 10 times more. And it's a two-way street. So when we look at the natural creation, it's a mag-grav condition plus a magnetical. And that is limited by the out tensity. And we look at the decay, it's a mag-grav condition plus the gravitational. And so that's part of the intensity. So our emission spectrum is the out tensity. Our absorption spectrum is the intensity being gravitational, the out tensity being magnetical. So our Earth space creation is a transmutation state of the coming together of these three dimensions, and each of these three dimensions is an inertia state. So it's a combination of two coming together. So the Earth space is from the point of view of the Earth in relationship to everything else, including the neighbors. And then the outer space transmutation state is also a product of the same things, the three dimensions. And then they come together. And then they need to be at a specific location. One moment, please. Excuse me. So when we look at the amino acid, we see that it's a product of the feeding coming together from the soul. And that's why we say we have to tune into that. Turn on to the power and drop out of our resistance. The combination of that is to provide the pattern so that you can get the energy. So therefore, every inertia field becomes a substitution. In other words, a transference of the gravitational dominance at the point of substitution, where the intensity equals zero and the out intensity equals zero. And then you're looking at the gravitational conformation. Which conformation? Is it the conformation that remains, or is it the conformation that dissolves? And so this substitution point is within the black hole field, because that becomes a transition point where you can go from the lowest energy state, the atomic, to the monatomic, to the polyatomic, to the plasma field state, or even one step beyond. But it's not just one step beyond. There could be many steps. But what about the other direction where we have the Coulomb barrier on this planet? Well, we can go beyond that as well, because it's a two-way street. And so here we are 1 year after the conference in Sanya, and we see the ramifications of the new Earth space consistency. The Earth space has been able to produce all the elements on the periodic table of elements, and so can the plasma science. We've been able to replicate the Earth space consistency. So it's a problem that we're hooked on matter state. But what we know is that there's an Earth space consistency, and there's the feeding. And there's an outer space consistency because we see the result. But as we see from this graph, which is representative of the energy from the group, why are we hooked? Are we hooked to the burrs, or are we hooked to the baggage? And so what this graph is showing is that basically our society has trained us to look at from the physicality up. And so our soul is down. We need to flip the poles. And one of the ways to do that is through awareness. The other way to do that is to feed the transmutation transition. The Earth is already doing that. And it's trying to balance the intensity and the out-intensity. Whether it's on the micro, or the atomic, or the macro, which is the planetary, and the connection to the other planets and everything else. And then our point is that there are many points on the field strength of the dove. How do we determine which field strength is there? It all depends on susceptibility, and if we're open to that susceptibility where we can make that determination, then we all become part of the pH of peace. And this is why the Keshe Foundation has called out the research teams to advance the plasma science, because peace and prosperity cannot happen or cannot continue without the humanity. So we're all learning about the transmutation in our flight testing. And so here we are in March, the second of 3 months of these sessions. And you're welcome to participate. We still have one more in session in March and then another one in April. And it's all part of the training of the transmutation flight system, where we have to understand that we cannot be matter state dominant. We have to be soul dominant. That's how we do the transmutation. So this range transition transcends the inertia field of the various transmutation dimensions. And the laws of conservation govern, sure, the covalent, trivalent, tetravalent bonding attributes. But this containment of inertia is manifest through the containment and contention of equality through all the energy states. So the soul of the man is also part of that and cannot be abandoned nor can be compromised. That is the uniqueness of the soul. And so the color of man is based on the integration with the soul of the man. It's the soul of the man that is reflecting the integrity of the man. So here we are hooked on the inertia unity, determined by pathing and susceptibility. So the emission of intention is offset by the emission of retention, and there's an interaction, and it manifests to create the emission of intention. What is your intention? Because this creates a balance of the contention, and that contention is of equality. And how can you be equal when some are more equal? So we have to set up our antennas to have a balance between the message feeding and the feedback. This affects the manifestation. So we have to tune our transmission to the various transition points where we can select one force, which is magnetical and balanced by the force selection of another, which is a gravitational force. So these resulting selections feed the maggrav manifestations. We're operating on 80% power. And this selection manifestation is predetermined. Who is doing the choosing? So it's your emission of intention consistently affects the standard folding deviation, leaves no room for war by choosing the peace dome of intention. So that transmutation manifests in balance with the peace dome. So what we're wanting to achieve is an augmented reality. We need to take into account that there is a flux, there is a flow towards, to, into, within, through, out of, and from every energy charge, every form, all mass, matter or substance. So the intensity and extensity is of what we are. We are and we need to be connected. That connection supports the flux of continuous change, and that connection is hooked on life. That's the greater oneness that we've been trying for 581 weeks in a row through the Knowledge Seekers workshops to bring together and transcend, to bring together the knowledge to transcend the limitations of nuclear science. And in comparison to our history, our transgenerational progress, it appears to be very sudden. And yes, that transcending will be very sudden. This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute of Teachings on Plasma Science, welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers learning about the new selection process of the new plasma science. So there's a world peace treaty. We need to choose it, sign it, and sign it with our true intention. As four-wheelers in a three-dimensional feeding inertia, we see that there are no straight lines to connect the dots of the fields of inertia. So can we go into outer space without a peace dome? Not really. The inertia of the present is governed by the dimensions of history. And so how do we impart the transition of energy states of these inertias? So we have to be hooked on the consistent inertia of life, of the physical. transmission dimensions. This plasma science is being delivered daily via the Peace Dome in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And this is the end of the lesson, and it is also the end of the intermediate inertia series. I hope you all enjoyed this trip. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. You've certainly put out a full buffet, I guess, of knowledge here today. I don't know if any of the participants would like to raise a point or ask a question. Let's go to them if we can, but thank you for trying to transfer your understanding to us, that we can add it to ours and become more successful at this whole process. I'm on board for the plasmatic feeding, without a doubt, especially if you can do it without any pain and suffering. And I haven't experienced much of that in this process of trying to feed more through the fields than the physicality. But let's see if anyone has a question or a point they'd like you to review. I know, Gail, you said you had a question, and I can't remember what it was, earlier this week about the background that Alex shared with the different size balls in it, going from the large to the smaller one, and I'm not sure what the question was. I don't know if you can remember it, but if not, then we'll go to someone else. And I can't remember exactly how she had worded the question, otherwise I would repeat it myself. But there was a question she was asking me, and I wasn't quite sure, so I thought, since we have the creator of the presentation here, Alex may be able to explain more.
Well, just in case, every field is a combination of the existence of that field plus the absorption and emission of energy. So the amount of energy that comes in versus the amount of energy that goes out will affect the density. And so there has to be a structure to accommodate that. But if we're looking just to maintain a balance, like as a catalyst, where it's not going to increase or decrease, then the energy coming in and the energy going out has to be balanced. But there's different energies that are coming in. And so if we look at the light as one energy source, then we know that in order for it to come into the field, it has to be absorbed. So if that light is absorbed into more and more dense fields, then it has a longer path to go. And so when it gets emitted, it has gone the same speed, but a farther distance. So in order to have the same distance of travel, it has to rotate around the core on an orbiting field closer to the core to account for the difference. So when we look at the wavelength to frequency ratio, the frequency is the number of cycles. So if it's a smaller diameter of orbit and the speed is the same, then you have a higher frequency. And if the diameter is greater and the speed is the same, then you have a lower frequency. And so we see the manifestation of this in light as the difference between being all the colors. Because all the colors are light and all the light travels at the same speed. That speed is the same within the field. Change the field, change the density, and you will change the light. Does that help, Mark?
Sounds simple enough, but we have to work with it, I suppose. I'm continuing to work with it.
Well, we
Anyone?
know for a fact
Yes.
that the light has a different frequency. So how can you be in the same field and have a different frequency?
I don't know. Are we talking space frequency or matter state? I know he talked about man has never understood how to create frequency the true way. And this, I guess, will be coming up in the future teachings. He talked about a space frequency, which has none of this up and down as the frequencies we understand in the matter state. It has its own sort of graph, I guess we could call it, but he didn't go into detail on that yet.
Well, I just have to draw your attention again to, the ice capades where one of the features is when you have all the skaters in a row and they go around in a circle, and the skater on the inside is having a big chuckle, whereas the skater on the outside is skating furiously to try and keep up because they have to go work hard to keep up with everybody else because they have a greater distance to go, but they are traveling a longer path. So it seems like they're going a lot faster, but all the skaters are dressed the same and they're all skaters. But when it comes to light, the light is a different color. So therefore, the light is going at the same speed and accommodating for the change in density by changing color, whereas the skaters are going at different speeds and accommodating it by how much energy they put in. And that is the difference between the physical matter and the plasmatic matter. Okay, let me add one more thing then, please. The light coming in from the sun is a certain color. But that color that it comes in at is manifest in all the colors of the rainbow everywhere. Whether it's the vertical people, the horizontal people, the humanity, or the elements of the earth. It's all in different colors. So how can the same color come to earth and manifest in all of these different colors? So it changes by energy as it's manifest from the combination of frequency and wavelength. So the energy is constant, but the frequency and the wavelength are changeable. But they are a direct correlation to a consistent energy. So if we were to change the energy, we could change the color. Ooh. You mean if we weren't so much as warmongers, and if we were more peace lovers, and if we were genuine in our intention, that we could change the color of our aura? Ask a clairvoyant what they think. I think we know the answer is yes. Ask a chameleon. Well, they're not going to say anything. They just change color. They'll still give you an answer.
Well, as we understand, there's only a short gap to fill of 20%. So I think we can do it either on our own or with assistance from some of the offers within the Keshe Foundation store. At least it's partially working for me. And I don't know where I'm going to go with this. I think you can reverse it. If you start eating again, then that process reverses itself, I believe. So we're going to stay at the level we're at for now, and then see how we can add to it and sort of totally detach. I think MOSFEC has the right idea where you start to do it on the soul level. Even imagine that apple or something else, and you can create the inertia and the fields of it, and I think you can absorb energies from it without any physical apple even being there.
Oh my God, Mark, you're starting to sound like a scientist.
We're all scientists, Alex. We're all, and welcome to the University of the Universe, or the the University of the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute, I probably should say. But again, the universal knowledge is very beautiful. We've never considered it, thought about it, or even applied it. And maybe we have in certain instances, but not in the conscious realm so much. We've always attributed something else to it. But it's great that we can walk away from the killing in space and on this planet.
Well, I'm so glad that you qualified that, because we differentiate between the conscious and the unconscious, but both are part of our reality. Both operate the same way. So the energy comes in, the energy goes out. So how we intensify and how we extensify is determined by what we are. So some of us are more skillful, and some of us are more belligerent. And that affects everything. It affects our own existence, it affects our neighbor's existence, and it affects the humanity's existence. And therefore, that affects the Earth's existence. So that connection is what supports the flux of the continuous change. And that connection, as I say, is hooked on life, because the life is in the conscious and in the unconscious. The life is always on. You can't turn it on or turn it off.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Anyone else want to raise a point or a question? I think once we get this ingrained, we'll be able to do much more. Gail has opened her mic. Yes, go ahead, Gail.
It's for Alex. Going to the three-dimensional graph where you have all the, it looks like the spinning top with all the circles. And I think you said that the smallest is the most powerful. But that's too complicated. I want the simple first one that you made.
Not that one. The one you showed last week, I think, Alex, from the small up to the large. Was the large one red, I think, and the small one was a different color? This is the one I think she had a question on.
Yeah. So when I looked at it, so this large red one is has a larger mass, I guess, and it's expansion, and then you come to the little guy at the X and Y axis, and it's supposed to be more powerful. Is that because it's compressed? Every one of them has the same um, hmm, material inside, but the little guy is more compressed and therefore he's stronger or
Uh,
not?
it is compressed. Of course, it has to be compressed because it's more dense.
Mhm.
And so because it's more dense, it has more energy.
Yes.
Now, if you allow that density to expand, then it won't be as dense.
It'll be more matter state because isn't that thing about the atoms, space between the atoms? So
It's
red,
about everything. It's trying to determine the relationship between the negative and the positive. So it has to do with a gradient charge. Is
okay.
looking at the different gradients. So which
Mhm.
one is positive, which one is negative? So if you're looking at it from the size standpoint, where the bigger is stronger than the weaker, then that would be the gradient. But since the smaller is closer to the core
Yes.
in the plasma state, that means it's more dense. So if it becomes more dense, that means it has more mass. If you look at the periodic table of elements, in the atomic structure, each element has more and more protons, and therefore more and more neutrons. And yet every one of them is an atom. So within the structure of the atom, there is more mass. So therefore it's more dense. If it's more dense, it has to have more energy. Think of a jack in the box. You keep squinching it down into the box until you get this big jack in the box into the box, and then you put a lid on it. Now you have all this potential energy, and you like to bring it to a party and say, "Hey, surprise!" And out it pops, and it's the same jack in the box, but now it's not in the box, it's out of the box. So that gravitational intensity has switched to magnetical outensity, and it bounced out of the box, but it's still a jack. It's just not a jack in the box. It's now a jack around the box or whatever.
Out of the box.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you said, no, I just realized I've been thinking about mass the wrong way then, because I thought mass was um like the size.
No,
So
mass is the energy.
so mass is energy. Is that
So
what you
what has more weight? So the conversion of mass on this planet is described as weight. So what has more weight? 100 pounds of steel or 100 pounds of feathers?
yeah, okay.
It's funny. That's a question my dad asked because he was so smarty pants and he tried to really fool me. And he says, "Oh, which is heavier?" And we all think of feathers as being light and steel being as heavy. But if you have 100 pounds of feathers, it would still be 100 pounds. It It's just that maybe you wouldn't be able to carry it because it's so big. Whereas maybe you wouldn't carry 100 pounds. Let's just say 1 pound of steel and 1 pound of feathers. How about that? So you could lift up a pound, but you wouldn't be able to, maybe the feathers would be a big bag and you wouldn't be able to carry it. But the weight is the same, but the mass, the density is not. The density of the feathers is much less.
So it's density then.
Yeah, so the amount of energy that's within that containment is the same because of the weight would be the same. But clearly the density of the steel is greater than the density of the feathers. So to have the same weight, there has to be something to offset it. So if you were to say the volume versus the weight, right? So now, which is more dense? Well, they're both the same density because they have the same weight. It's just that the feathers occupy more space than the steel. So there's a relationship, and that's the same that's true for the light. Light has the same energy, but some light travels at a higher frequency, and we've measured that frequency, and then we've been able to determine the spectrum of the particular element. And so each element has a color spectrum, and that is an indication not only of the light, but the light becomes representative of the mass.
I have to really learn about mass then, because I thought of mass as being bigger.
Well,
But I didn't.
how big?
No, don't. If we're supposed to have the same mass no matter where we are in the universe, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So if you look at the containment dependency here of the hydrogen, the carbon, the nitrogen, and the oxygen, they all have a different fingerprint. So this happens to be the absorption spectrum. But the absorption spectrum shows you all the light that used to be there, but it's been absorbed by the element. And so what you see is what is not being absorbed. What you're seeing is what's being reflected. Now, if you're looking at an emission spectrum, then the opposite is true. Where you have the dark spots, they would be light and they would be of the color that black occupies in that spectrum. And all the other colors, well, they would be black. So the emission spectrum is only going to show you what is coming at you. And what is coming at you is what you see. And what you don't see is what is not coming at you. And that's the problem with our understanding of the universe. We only see what we see and acknowledge what we see. That what we don't see, well, we kind of slough it off and say, well, nobody knows what is there, but obviously the soul doesn't know where it is. And so we need to engage our soul because the soul knows better than we do. So when we are matter state dominant, we're only looking at the emission spectrum. You're not
Yes.
seeing the absorption spectrum at all. And if you were to measure all the dark lines on each spectrum, it would represent a tiny, tiny fraction of that whole spectrum, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So we are really looking at a tiny picture, and it isn't 1/3. It isn't even 1/10. It's probably a smaller fraction than that. But you can see that the nitrogen absorbs more than the nitrogen absorbs more than the carbon, but less than the oxygen. And then you look at the hydrogen, it absorbs the least. So the hydrogen is the least dense. The oxygen is the most dense. And according to the periodic table of energy, the hydrogen is the atomic of 1, carbon is 6, nitrogen 7, oxygen 8. So it fits. So if you want to understand the basic science, you have to see here. So, and why is it red or why is it blue? Because that's the whole spectrum and how it goes. So we know based on frequency that the blue is of a higher density.
I mean, according to the Earth and its amino acids. And are created from those amino acids. So that's why we're so limited. So this means once we start to see with the soul, everything will be expanded into.
Oh my God, another plasma scientist. This is
I'm
wonderful.
how excited because Mr. Kesha is always saying that we would be so amazed or astounded at what we would see if we were in the universe. Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's great, boy. That's now each of us is our goal is to be able to explain it to others in a easy to understand, concise way, so that we don't get into a fight. No, seriously, you don't want people, verbally abusing you and, saying, "Oh, what do you know?" You're not a rocket scientist. Yeah, well, I'm not a window washer either, but I know when my window is dirty. Um, there's a cross-channeling of knowledge. And that's one of the things that is offending an awful lot of people is because the plasma science is cross-channeling all the knowledge. Why? Because all the knowledge comes from the same source. And all the knowledge is operating by the same rules. So whether it's chemistry or biology or metallurgy or archaeology, it's all following the same rules. Okay, so there's no reason to have a bone of contention. It's just, not all of us, if all of us did the same thing, imagine if we were all engineers.
Oh,
We'd all be living in a box. Oh, come to think of it, isn't that what condominiums are? They're caves, only they go up vertically. That was a bad example. How about if we were all if we were all musicians? Some musicians make more money than other musicians, right? So some musicians have to beg for money on the street. And so I think most of us would be just sitting on the street begging for money because if we were all musicians, who'd be doing the work? If we were all musicians, then we'd all be on stage. There'd be nobody in the audience.
imagine the creation that we would have.
Yeah, that would be called cacophony.
Yeah.
Just stepping away for a moment. Be right back.
I guess the thought made Mark leave the room. Well, let's see, I had amazing way of explanation here, and I love the art that you produce here.
Yeah, you're having fun with it, are you?
Well, I think you are.
Yeah, I
Right?
am.
Yeah, it does. It makes it very enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay,
Well,
I'm back.
so Gail, you are a teacher, you have skill, and if you combine that skill with added knowledge, then you are improving your skill.
Yeah.
So now you have to look for a practical application. So how do we take this knowledge and say compare it to grocery shopping or buying a car or a relationship, in the family or having a relationship with a business associate. And so that's called ecology. And so there's an ecology that we think of as the environmental impact on the planet, but there's an ecology of the mind as well. So that's the environmental impact on the mind of the humanity. So you cannot, as humanity, extricate yourself from the planet. We're all part of that humanity. So to be at war with each other is really, well, we know what it is. It's dumb, is what it is.
Doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah. So if the purpose of life is to be at war, then why don't we just solve the whole crisis and just all of us leave?
Except they won't want us.
But you don't think that they wouldn't allow migrants on other planets?
I don't think anybody would want us. We're a disaster. But we're working on it. That's the main thing.
Yeah, the feeding doesn't seem like it's too far-fetched if we're already doing 80%. We have a very short gap to fill, but again, it's up to you to experiment, play with it, and see how you can absorb more step by step. But no one, I don't think, can do it for you. And I think once it becomes ingrained, then we'll certainly have the ability to move in different places and have the confidence of feeding ourselves plasmatically.
Yeah,
Much
certainly.
cleaner.
Well,
Mhm.
and in order to be ingrained, it has to be repeated. So what is being repeated to us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is, thou shalt not kill except when, you have a gun and you are fighting with somebody. Uh, you know, so murder is against the universal law unless man allows it. It's actually mind-boggling. So we are disconnected. That's the whole point, because the soul of the man will never kill another man. Will not happen. So the only way that we can do it is to be childish in our ways of saying, okay, well, now that we're born, we're going to do things better. Okay, and so we're going to do it our way. So that's where we come matter state dominant. So all we have to do is realize, and when I say all we have to do, it sounds so very simple, but it is. It's an attitude change, like Gail says. Okay, so we have to think in terms of what am I creating? Why am I creating it? And look at the result. And am I satisfied with that result? And if I'm not, what can I do to change it? So, if you're having an argument with somebody, there's two ways to change it. You either stop arguing or you get them to stop arguing. Well, if you are at a level and you want to engage someone who's argumentative, then you automatically recognize that they're at a lower level. So in order for you to argue with them, you have to come down to their level. So how about they come up to your level? If they come up to your level, they won't argue with you. They might have a difference of opinion, but that opinion will be handled differently. It won't be handled with war. It'll be held with diplomacy. It'll be held with discourse. Because every time there's a disagreement, literally, it's an absence of knowledge.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, well, that's my philosophical, scientific outlook for today.
When you understand the point of view, see where behavior is coming from, and you can handle it.
So Gail is going to be bringing next week's class then. She's graduated.
Thanks a lot. Are you need a break?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for allowing me to continue to present, and I can't believe it's the end of the intermediate series here. We're going to continue with the advanced series, and we'll try and do our homework so that we make it as palatable as possible and continue on our merry way. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alex. We continue to add to the knowledge.